Hello and welcome to the Dingometer, where we tackle tricky issues in teaching and learning design and examine the factors that produce awesome learning experiences. Now, the extent to which university graduates are employable is a topic that's almost guaranteed to provoke a discussion, despite the fact that there's a great many people working in universities to produce employable graduates and doing amazing work. There continues to be some really alarming statistics about this disconnect between universities and employers. And there's reports such as there was an ISE report that in 2024, 27% of graduates didn't meet employers' expectations. But then on the other hand, there's reports that graduates often struggle to find jobs because there's market saturation and employers have got unrealistic expectations. So it's a really nested and complex problem. And in this episode of the podcast, we want to try and make some headway into what's actually happening, particularly focusing on creative industries. So to debate this issue, I'm delighted to be joined today by my colleague and friend Phil Gom, Director of Learning Experiences at Ding, and by our guest, Derek Yates, Director of the Creative Lab at Ravensbourne University, London. Derek and Phil, a very warm welcome to you both.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Derek, you're Director of the Creative Lab at Ravensbourne, but perhaps it'd be good if you could start by giving us an insight into what you do, what Creative Lab is, what is it, and how does it work?
Great, yeah, and I'll be very happy to do that. I spent quite a lot of time doing that actually, because we're kind of deliberately nebulous. It's kind of part of, I think it's part of the kind of philosophy of what we do. And I actually come out of a quite a long meeting this week where we're kind of trying to nail it down. Lots and lots of rewrites and writes of copy. But I suppose, yeah, I'm the head of Creative Lab, not the director. I don't want to get in trouble with my boss. So I'm the head of Creative Lab. Creative Lab exists within the Directorate of Industry, Innovation and Enterprise at Ravensbourne. We've got this kind of four-pronged attack on employability, really. So we're in one corner, we've got knowledge exchange and research. In the other corner, we've got what we call the Startup Lab. So Startup Lab is a kind of 6-month course for relate to enterprise for students who want to start their own business. And then we've got the Careers Lab, which I kind of feed into, and I was kind of part of the setup of. And Careers Lab kind of runs our work-based learning module, provides career support, funnily enough. And then there's the Creative Lab, which is a kind of, so I think the idea is that you've got this kind of, these four corners, and there's a kind of feed from corner to corner and all the way around of industry engagements, collaborative projects, kind of student projects, work-based learning initiatives, and also research projects, I think the relationship between, work-based learning and knowledge exchange is an interesting one that can be quite dynamic. So I suppose the idea really is that it's quite a dynamic group of hubs, really support hubs that work together. But sorry, I digressed, didn't I? But I think it's useful to explain that whole ecosystem really, and because I think that's part of what we're trying to do at Ravensbourne is to create this kind of ecosystem of industry engagement. Creative Lab is, I suppose, put at its most simple, a space where industry and education can discover and learn together. And that is not an agency that offers services to brands. And I think that's a distinction that I'm really keen to make, because a lot of universities have kind of this idea of a creative agency, and I think they're seen as kind of income generators. But I think that's not what we want. I think obviously we'd like to create income, but I think our remit is much more about student experience and supporting employability. So what we aim to do is offer a kind of really dynamic engagement with industry, and it's a kind of two-sided one, So sorry, I don't want to, because obviously I'm going to be talking about this in more detail, but yeah, I think it's an exciting kind of new thing. Probably not new. I'm sure somebody out there is going to be like, yeah, we've been doing that for years. But yeah, it feels interesting and dynamic and hopefully fit for purpose.
No, that's really helpful because just in that explanation, you've highlighted that it isn't just as simple as, hey, let's get graduates ready for employment. And there is this sort of negotiated discursive space between universities, graduates and employers. And you mentioned this idea of a creative agency. And Phil, I know that's something that when you were running your course, you went into this space because you were all about producing employable graduates. And I think you ended up setting up an agency, didn't you? So,
I was going to say, as you were talking, Derek, I was like, we tried to do that, but we didn't manage it. I'll be honest with you. It just seemed such a no-brainer to leverage all these very talented people and put them in front of people who needed work done, in the knowledge that there was a sort of a safer space. So these employers understood that they were dealing with this agency, so they had a responsibility to incubate and to sort of be sort of empathic towards sort of like, undergraduates. It felt like to me, I think what you were saying there about it is not a creative agency because there's a slight sense it faces two ways, that sort of employers learn something too. So it's not this kind of just one way transactional. So I struggle to do it. Although it seemed like such an obvious thing to do, and just producing the momentum and then producing. So the bit I'm interested in actually is where this happens. So how do you create the meeting ground between the two things? When does it happen? I'm looking at sort of in the timetable. Where does it happen, and how do you produce the effect where the two worlds are able to kind of look each other in the eye?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and I think that creative agency question, I want to touch upon that just for a little bit longer, because I think I think you make really interesting points. Is that I think the problem with students taking on client briefs is they're not professional, and they're not of a standard that, and they need to be allowed to be that, and there is a danger I've seen at other institutions. I'm sure, I'm sure your studio wasn't like it, but there are, this idea that we'll offer our students up as cheap labor, is problematic in that it undermines the industry in so many ways. It undermines the industry in terms of pricing to a certain extent, but it also undermines the industry by saying, do you know what? What we do is so easy that even before people are qualified, we can get them to do it for you. And that's kind of it's kind of problematic. So I suppose that kind of, I think the really important thing for me is a respect for the industry, and a recognition that the professional people that we work with are people that are trying to build a business and survive in a kind of difficult climate, and we can support and help in that rather than undermine it. Oh shit, sorry.
That's time up. You've got to go. You're too busy.
Apologies.
We got 10 minutes.
Okay, I'll leave that over there. I've switched. I'm on. Son, should have asked me when I come on. Is your phone?
Live telly. Is what happens.
In terms of where it fits into the timetable, I think that is again a really interesting, important question, because making space for employability in the timetable is a huge challenge. For every institution. I'm sure if we had other academics on the call, I think they'd kind of go, yeah, but where are we going to fit this in? We've got 3 years, and we're trying to get somebody to understand the implications of AI, learn typography, be an animator, like all of the things that our students need to pick up across 3 years, so where you find time for this kind of activity is super important. So I think one thing I'd say is it needs to connect in to the kind of wider context of the student experience. It can't be something that kind of sits over here. But it needs to have its own space. I think it needs to have its own space in the curriculum. And so we have a work-based learning module at Ravensbourne that takes place kind of at the end of their second year. And it's a slot where the students only do work-based learning, and they do everything from placements to live projects to, you know, projects that are facilitated by the Creative Lab, and that's a kind of good slot for a lot of our projects, really. So I'll talk later about the project we're doing with Uncommon, but that kind of fits into that kind of 4-week work-based learning slot, and students can just focus on it, you know, like they can, you know, they can give it kind of their 100% attention and really immerse themselves in it.
And so just practically, is that a university-wide module? All courses have that slot at the end of the second year to fit that in?
Yeah, it's a university. I mean, they're really for hard things to do, right? A university-wide module, you know, like it's taken some kind of gentle persuasion of kind of lots of academics to be able to negotiate that slot, really. And there are still some courses that aren't quite bought into not having anything in that slot. But yeah, it's a university-wide module. At Ravensbourne, obviously, we are a small university, you know, so it makes it, we're kind of 6,000 students at the moment. So it kind of, you know, it's slightly easier for us to do that. And the courses kind of fit within a lens. We're kind of business tech, creative, business tech and creative. So, and there's a kind of connection across those courses, really, you know. So, but it's university wide.
I want to talk to you. You mentioned some of these projects, and when we talked previously, you've mentioned some of the projects that you've worked with and some impressive clients. So people like the Obama Foundation, the Uncommon Ad Agency, and I'm particularly interested in how these work to change students' mindsets, because, like you say, you've got to be careful of the live brief. But I mean, how do you go beyond that? How do you set up these projects, and how does it impact students? What's the kind of the route into these projects for students, and what happens to them as they go through those projects?
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, I love talking about the Obama Foundation project, because it's just like I can't claim any credit. No, I kind of support it, but that is my director, Lawrence Latte, who kind of has facilitated that project and pulled in that opportunity over kind of the last kind of 4 years, really.
So that, how does it work?
So that is a collaborate. Well, it's built out of a relationship with the Obama Foundation first and foremost. They support the project in terms of time, organisation. My brother's Keeper are a kind of affiliate of the Obama Foundation. They're based in Chicago in the USA. Obviously, the Obama Foundation is based in America. And what happens is that they select a group of students from the south side of Chicago. We select a group of students from our cohort. It's a kind of open application. We have a selection procedure that is designed around inclusivity. We've got kind of criteria around race and gender, and you know, a kind of economic profile, and those two groups of students come together. The UK students go out to Chicago. They take part in some kind of projects out there and workshops, but they also kind of visit. You know, they go on visits and, you know, like experience Chicago, but not experience the kind of bright lights. Experience the south side of Chicago, which is a kind of you know, which is a very different environment, really, you know. And so they, yeah, there's a little film about it, and they go to some amazing places, and is it where Jay Dilla made his music, and like loads of kind of brilliant stuff like that. And then the students from Chicago come to the UK. So we've done three actually. We did one during lockdown, which was based in New York, actually, not Chicago, and was purely online. But I think the most impressive project, I suppose, was a project that we did where we brought in Jordan brands from Nike, and they set a brief, but they also created a whole load of activities in Chicago. So they met Don C. Don C's he's the kind of basketball apparel king. They met Tinker Hatfield, for God's sake, who created the original Air Jordan, and then the students came back to the UK and they worked on a project for the Nike Future Forward Festival, which was a kind of set of basketball uniforms, and the students they attended and were interviewed at the launch of the festival, and they met Colin Kaepernick, which again is another kind of off the scale crazy experience for them. So and I think that project, on the one level, it's kind of it's all got all of the bells and whistles, really, but I think the most important thing about that project is the focus around inclusivity and the kind of the idea that of taking students out of their context into another context, giving them an experience that they'll grow from. And the outcome's not really important. The outcome's brilliant, to be honest with you, but the outcome's not really what's important. The experience is what's important, really, and we did a similar project last year or the year before, I can't remember, where we brought Nestle into the project, and the students produced a kind of reimagined the kind of Kit Kat brand for Gen Z, and they went up to York and kind of pitched to the exec team in York their ideas, and that's hopefully going to be kind of in the process of being turned into a new idea for packaging Kit Kat that will be sold in airports. So they're kind of great.
This idea of the live brief, but I mean, I mentioned just on that point there, you mentioned earlier on about not putting up students as cheap labor. How does that work then? How do you bring the employers in, but how do you create that supportive environment where you broker those expectations between the employers and the students so that everyone gets something positive out of it?
Well, yes, I think that's super important. So I think that's about the negotiation that happens before we set the brief. I think it's about the way we talk about Creative Lab. I think it's about how we promote Creative Lab. I think up front, I do a lot of what I did at the beginning of this podcast, and I go, we're not a creative agency, actually. We facilitate collaborations, so immediately up front, you're saying, look, we're not service providing here, and to be honest with you, we have service provided on projects. Like we work with the Alcatel submarine network, and that was a kind of straightforward, we'll sell you some, we'll provide you some, we'll put student team together, we'll provide you some ideas for a new recruitment campaign, and a lot of what we get is and it's also why people come to us. Like, I think one of the brilliant things about Ravensbourne is that we have one of the most diverse student cohorts in the UK, and our students in London, or have been a majority kind of students from London. So immediately it's like, well, kind of we've got this thing, our resource here, what we're bringing to the party is this, it's not just graphic design skills, it's not just filmmaking skills, it's a set of young people that have a really interesting perspective on your brand actually, and you can get some kind of insights from that. But I think what I'm really careful to do in the kind of initial conversation around any project is my pet hate, and I'll share this on to the world, is when a brand or a company or a kind of practitioner comes to us and says, I really feel like I want to give something back, you know. Because it's like, you wouldn't, that immediately we're in a kind of, there's a hierarchical relationship here where, you know, I'm doing as I'm told to a certain extent, you know, what my students are doing as they're told, and you just won't get as much out of us if that's the conversation. So it's got to be a two-sided equal conversation, and I think before we start a project, we always talk really carefully to the brand or whoever we're going to collaborate with about what they are going to get out of the project, and what our students are going to get out of the project. And it's always framed through education. And I suppose that the Uncommon project is a kind of good example of that. And also we talk about the kind of experience rather than the outcomes. You know, if a project is just based around the outcomes, then it's not going to tick all of our criteria, you know. So the Uncommon project is, we're taking a group of students into Uncommon, and they're gonna create this incubator. We're calling it a creative incubator within the studios at Uncommon. And you know, if anyone's listening to this and they don't know who Uncommon are, have a look at them. You know, they are so refreshing in the world of advertising. You know, like they are, you know, everything's about purpose. Everything's about creating something. Their whole thing is that most, you know, 90% of people, you know, most people wouldn't care if 90% of brands just disappeared tomorrow. You know, like, so if you want to matter in the world, come to, you know, work with Uncommon, and every one of their projects has something more to it, you know. So they were a really brilliant partner, and we targeted Niels Leonard, shamefully stalked him, you know, because we really wanted to work with them. And so in that project, you know, like, you know, there's a kind of a journey that we go on in terms of the student experience. So, you know, they meet the students, they came in and gave a kind of talk about their work. Then we had a selection day. We had a call out for selection. Our students posted their work to a Padlet board with a kind of, you know, mini essay about why they wanted to work with Uncommon. Then they selected from that list. We created a selection day at Uncommon, which happened on the 13th, so 2 weeks ago. And that meant that we could open up that experience to a much wider range of students, because it's always a difficult thing, is hitting, you know, how you kind of make sure that as many students as possible get this experience, and you're not just catering for the, you know, the really motivated students who get their portfolio in on time and haven't got 15 part-time jobs to survive. You know, like it's really, really important. Anyway, so they had this brilliant day at Uncommon, which was kind of really multifaceted. They had portfolio reviews. They took part in a design creative sprint. You know, like they had this kind of one-to-one speed dating session with the people who work for Uncommon. And, you know, Uncommon, one of the reasons why we work with Uncommon is because they've got a kind of, they see these kind of collaborative projects as part of their business as a studio. So there's already a raft of projects that they do that aren't income generating. So the Thomas Heatherwick collaborations that they've done around kind of contemporary architecture, you know, like a really good example, Rat Boot, that they did for the for New York Fashion Week, you know, like, so they've got that thing. It's like, we want to make stuff to find out stuff, and then that informs the stuff that we do with brands, you know, like, and that strikes me as being a really kind of exciting way to operate as a creative agency. So the students are visiting the studio, and they're not working on a client brief. They're working on a brief that is about reimagining the iconography of the UK, which is, you know, which is in desperate need of being reimagined, right? When you look at what the Cross of St George means and what the Union Jack means for big proportions of our country, our population. So,
there's something interesting so thank you for sharing that, because through those describing those projects, lots of thoughts came out of that, but particularly there's something around obviously the diversity of the cohort, and like you said, what you bring to the table, but also something around brokering power. And it reminded me of some of the work that Phil did with his students, you know, sort of taking a whole group of students, and it was a ref funded project, wasn't it, Phil? But it was the same sort of thing. It was about suddenly they were in a different experience when you were doing things like Marks and the Pudding Pans and Red in the Kingdom of Sound. There were these big projects that sat outside the curriculum, but in doing that, the students had this experience of, oh, hang on, we're in this together. This isn't as the power relations are different. So, Phil, can you just say a little bit about that and how that worked with your students as well? Because it sounds like there's some similarities here in terms of what happens and its effect on employability.
Well, I will talk about that, but I am interested in, and it's been sort of all the way through this around employability and power brokering and where the power is. And I think it helps me understand why employability isn't always welcomed. It helps me understand the mystery of why. I mean, for example, somebody posted sort of on LinkedIn that we were going to do this restream, and they framed it as, really, I mean, in a creative sort of mischievous sense, like, really still talking about employability? Is it still a problem? What's going on? Blah, 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 blah. And I do want to talk about that, because I think it's about power and brokering. I think that's all interesting. But yes, certainly some of the most rewarding and tangible experiences of producing sort of employability Velcro in the young people I worked with, you know, when you knew that you were doing the work and that you were producing these experiences that, for example, in an interviews format, or when they were, you know, sort of talking about themselves anecdotally to get their first job, if they referred to this work that they had done, it would have that Velcro vibe, because it was a project brief that was operating in an interesting space. So yeah, we did some big projects with sort of Heritage Lottery and European funding, but the reality, the boots on the ground vibe was that the students, there was a risk, a delivery risk, there was a genuine deadline, there was genuine audiences, there was a genuine sense that this work would be picked up and engaged with by people who hadn't been part of the process, didn't care about learning outcomes, didn't care who'd worked on it. All they cared about was whether or not the experience would land. And I think that gave everybody in those experiences a frisson that was just absolutely distinctively different from delivering a project brief or something. The frisson came from the fact there was going to be an audience, and the work had to live in its own right. It couldn't be caveated by some students made this, and it couldn't be caveated by this was done alongside all of our other jobs. It just had to work for audiences. And I think certainly from my lot's perspective, that was question asked and question answered in terms of the value of those sort of outward facing projects. But the thing about power, I think, is really, I was going to ask you, Derek, because obviously all the projects you're doing, they're like sort of honey in terms of employability. It's about what is an institution doing around employability, and you've got this set of extraordinary answers. It was one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you in the first place. It was like, one of my concerns when I was teaching was always when someone said to me, what are you going to do about employability? I had the things I would roll out. I would have the projects that were sort of, I knew were good. And I was always interested in the students we hadn't reached. And because when you're brokering power, some students didn't want to do it. Some students you didn't necessarily feel that they would prosper in that space. And so there was a sense of like, can we be doing more? And I was going to ask you this question about, do you think that sort of encouraging and engendering employability is something that can happen at the earliest stage on a course, as it doesn't associate with kind of rock and roll projects and exciting clients? You know, is there something that can be done before that stage? Is there work around employability? And we haven't even discussed if we agree on the term yet and whether what we understand by the term employability, but maybe we should do that bit first. But because you've got this extraordinary resource and you've got this brilliant network of clients, and I'm just thinking about whether when employability should begin and end on in a sort of an HE environment. Like, can it start earlier than at the end of year 2, for example? You know, how was it achieved in that respect? So there's the ideas, your ideas. I'd like to pick your brains about that, around employability as a vibe, not just as a brief or as an engagement with external companies. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I love your term employability Velcro. I think that's brilliant, and because actually, it's in my answer to your question. Really, is that's kind of what a course needs, is some employability Velcro between the different elements of it. You know, like it's a really brilliant way of describing it, actually. You know, so I think my answer to your question is yes, absolutely. And so I think employability needs to be from day one of every course. But in order for that to work, it requires a different definition of what employability is. So at Ravensbourne, we've got, by the way, I hate that thing when you get people on and they do this big advert for their institutions. I'm trying not to do that, but we've got a kind of, and it's kind of evolving, actually. And I wouldn't say it's perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but where it works really well is we've got this module called professional life practice that students study in every semester of every year of the course, apart from the final semester of the course, which is just focused on kind of, getting their stuff together to go out. And it's an interesting story because it relates to what you're saying, actually, because so I was kind of part of the kind of original kind of group of people that were kind of trying to work out how that would be structured. And in its original iteration, I think the interpretation of the module was that in every semester of every year of every course, students revisit their CV and their portfolio, and that's absolutely wasn't my vision of what that was. But in the hands of some course leaders, like that, and it's not criticism of those course leaders at all. It's like people have varying degrees of kind of experience or engagement with the notion of employability. So some people, some course leaders were like, okay, if we do employability, what we're doing is we're creating a personal brand and we're giving students the tools to secure employment, right? And it's kind of makes sense that somebody would think that, but I think so we're now revisiting. We realize that we need to put in place some scaffolding that will help course leaders understand how that employability might build across 3 years of a course. So and that I won't go into it in detail, but I think what we're now thinking about, and what we've always wanted to happen, is that there is a structured journey where each element builds on the last element, and it's not about creating a CV and it's absolutely not about working to a blueprint provided by employers. Like, it's absolutely not that. And I will vehemently argue against that as a thing, because a lot of employers don't even know what they want, like, and actually, I think for a lot of employers, what they think they want isn't always what they want,
Well,
like,
would you mind if I just told, because on that point, I just tell you a quick story, because obviously the course that I used to look after was animation, so it was highly externally regulated by expectations. And
yeah,
I remember I was prepping the accreditation for skill set or screen skills or whatever it was then, and I remember trying to find out what employability might mean, just so I could sort of like figure it all out. I sort of had a sense of what was important about what we were trying to give these young people. And I remember on YouTube, I watched a convened panel meeting when the great and the good of VFX and CGI all got together to talk about employability. And this will surprise you not at all, which is that panel failed to agree entirely on what employability. You had somebody who at one end of the table who was very clear that they were only interested in employing graduates who could slot in oven ready and do essentially quite pedestrian pipeline straight away, because essentially they just needed enough boots on the ground to make an avalanche or a volcano erupt or something. And then you had somebody on the other end of the table who said that they absolutely did not want that. And they were looking for someone with a more disruptive, innovative. And then the other person on the end of the table said, yeah, we've got enough creative directors. We can't have animation courses telling people that they can be directors. We can't have animation courses that deal with story and narrative and all those things, because we just want people who can do run cycles. So that was one. And then on the other side, it was like, oh my God, that sounds like an appalling dystopian expression of a discipline, which is... Anyway, so I watched that and I remember just feeling, to agree to your point, that employability as a narrative in the mouths of employers is as unagreed upon and difficult to act upon. So no wonder that sort of sometimes when it's when universities are seeking to react and seeking to look responsive, that they in the end cleave to, oh, we mean CVs or we don't, and you end up in this sort of quite difficult contested space, right, around employability, which I think is often not acknowledged enough, which is a contested space. Employability is not a term that we all necessarily can agree upon, right?
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. And I think what we've arrived at with professional life practice is that what that module is about, as it kind of progresses across the 3 years, is engagement into the debate as to what the industry wants, what it doesn't want, where it's going, like what current practice looks like, what future practice looks like, what, and talking to employers. And we've got this, so we kind of start in the first year, and it's a sense of understanding what your subject is, first and foremost. It's a sense of trying to kind of break some of the kind of passive kind of behavior that schools engender in students. It's about making students more proactive. It's about teaching research skills. It's about what the design press is, or what the the debate around particular subjects looks like, and where you can access it. And then as they move into the second semester, then that gets a little bit more targeted, and it's about they create a kind of report around industry practice that needs to be informed by primary research. So they kind of have to go out, and the best ones go out and actually start talking to people, and then that moves into the second semester, and we introduce the Rave Late program, which you're probably aware of, that which is a kind of monthly kind of event that takes place and is live streamed. We get students to work on it, so students produce all the promotional material. Students film it, they edit it, they package it, they put it out to the world, and we look at things like we don't look at industries. We look at ideas and behaviors that connect across a number of industries. So we did brilliant, one of the really great rave late that was called Use Your Voice. That was about being authentic to who you are as a creative practitioner. And we got practitioners in who didn't fit the kind of cliche of what the industry looks like or sounds like, and had kind of been brave enough to be themselves and use their voice. And they talked about kind of their experience. We talk about excellence, or we talk about building community, or we talk about collaboration. So they're kind of ideas. They're not this industry looks like this is what the employers want, now go out and do it. They encourage our students to question and encourage but most importantly, they encourage our students to engage. And that feels, and then they go off and do their work-based learning, and then they come back and they unpack all of that experience, and then that feeds into their planning for their final semester. But I just wanted to say one more thing about kind of inclusion and accessibility, because you raised that point as well, and I completely agree with you that if we're trying to affect change and we're trying to make our industries more diverse, that has to be done proactively, because there is a natural kind of filtration that happens, that comes from somebody growing up in a household where, they're made to feel confident, and they're made to they're introduced to the networks, the world of being employed in the creative industries, for example, feels quite familiar to them. And a kid who has no experience of that, has grown up with no books in their house, and all of those things, right, that kind of disadvantage some students, and they're doing 5 jobs in order to be on the course. And it's really important it's always, it's important to the team that I work with in work-based learning that we proactively engage with that paradigm and don't ignore it, and don't pretend that the privileged students will get a better experience if we do nothing. So that's why, that's one of the reasons why we've chosen this kind of broad definition of work-based learning, because it means that if it was just placement, lots of people have been like, oh yeah, but you do placements. And it's like, no, we do work-based learning, which is a slightly different thing. But work-based learning offers us the flexibility to create interventions that support the disadvantaged students. So we specifically create experiences. So we've got Creative Conscience Project. We work with New Wave magazine. We work with Black Create Connect, and through working with them, we set up experiences that are accessible to the students who maybe don't and are not initially engaged, who are really worried about the experience. The best comment that we got in our feedback from work-based learning this year, and we had a 87% pass rate, was that a student talked about how terrified he was, even talking to an employer, and he said the difference that work-based learning made for me is that I've had a conversation with an employer, and that kind of small victory. I always use that quote in the kind of, because it's like, yeah, okay, we got 600 students to do a work placement, and there's a big list of clients, that's very impressive. But that one student taking that one small jump is just as important as working with Blackmagic or Nestle or Nike or whatever, So sorry, I got involved.
No, it's fine. There is just a small point I want to make around, again, one of the things that I think Tony and I are interested in is structural changes that produce the conditions for enhanced employability, just the structural things. And so obviously work, so the sort of work-facing, employer-facing, modules that are built in that. But one of the thing that the very small thing I just want to talk about, as you were talking about inclusivity and about how inclusivity and employability are kind of like, they can be mutually exclusive of one another if you don't notice or care about those things. And certainly in the institution that I work for, you had to worry and consider the factors weighing against someone's employability that were to do with their social economic experience and the way they've been, their upbringings and all those other things, because employability is not guaranteed by getting a first-class degree. Employability is not guaranteed by any of those things. Employability is often this kind of, that Velcro, it is often connected to issues of class and confidence and all sorts of sort of non-learning outcome driven things, which you can, so sort of social justice things. And one of the things that I wasn't always popular, one of the things that I was very interested in was looking at learning outcomes. Learning outcomes aren't interesting at all, I know, but one of I always wondered why in like year 1, year 2, year 3, whatever, when you looked at sort of the learning outcomes, there was nothing, certainly in the course I first inherited, there was nothing in that structure where you could talk about behaviors that would either disempower or produce power in young people. So for example, punctuality, boring things, confidence in speaking, just these boring things. Literacy, not meant sort of the three R's, but just the confidence to use language, the confidence to write emails, those sorts of things. There are loads of learning outcomes around the synthesizing of research materials, and loads of learning outcomes around the 3-act story structure. But the modes by which young people were creating work, interacting with more knowledgeable others, with one another, there was no structures to talk about that. So all you could do was just sort of notice that somebody was struggling, have a quiet word with them, but you couldn't pull it into the mainstream of what you were doing. And one of the things I was very keen to do, because I was deeply interested in employability, was to make sure that even in those very basic structural things, that you could have conversations around professionalizing people's behaviors. So in other words, one of the learning outcomes was benchmarked against professionalism. And professionalism was then unpacked out further to describe a series of kind of social behaviors and interactions which were likely to give the young person more or less power. So for me, it was always about power. It's like, how can you engender power, and how can you have conversations around power with people who perhaps didn't realize that they were that the battleground was unfair, sort of didn't know that there was this other bunch of things working against their employability. I found that to be quite just a unshowy, unsimple expression of trying to do something around employability, which was simply about, can we talk about it yet? Can we have conversations around work behaviors and collaborative behaviors, which we know align with someone's ability to be confident and powerful in employment sort of spaces. So those people were never going to put themselves forward for any work placements if we hadn't done that work in sort of at level 4, if you know what I mean. So it was like those unshowy mechanisms, those core mechanisms for employability that I think sometimes they don't get talked about very much in a way. I don't know what your feelings are about that.
It's a really, really good point. And it's so true, so true. And again, I come back to our PLP modules. Yeah. It's a conversation that I'm having, like literally, last week, the week before, next week, with course leaders about what PLP is, and I think, yeah, it's like, it kind of connects into kind of looking beyond the kind of initial interpretation of employability and thinking about what empowers employability in a nuanced way, you know, and I think that, like, for example, the kind of first semester PLP module that I was talking about earlier, you know, like I think I've been having a conversation with course leaders about how, you know, that module is a really, really good opportunity for you to start to identify what the additional needs of your students are in terms of neurodiversity. You know, like, you know, it's a really good point for you to start identifying what their needs are in terms of supporting literacy, you know, in terms of their ability to present, their ability to research, you know, like, and exactly what you say, those kind of just core competencies that some, because of background, because of education, because of lots and lots of reasons, some students don't have, and some students have in spades. You know, like but it doesn't, in the long run, you know, like, that doesn't necessarily, you know, we need to rebalance that, you know, because otherwise what you get is what we have, which is a really unequal, unrepresentative
what you get is, you get the idea. I was just going to say, what you get, and it's to do with student satisfaction and the folklores of employability. What you get is the idea that the subject they've come to study is will produce the intended effect on leaving. So if they're really good at something, it will produce, if they really like something, it will produce the intended effect. And then they'll look back at their degree course and wonder why this thing there's been a failure to launch. And there's a whole bunch that's nested, there's a whole bunch of reasons. But I think this is not always a popular idea, that the subject specificity, this is where I think I'm not talking about your course leaders at all, I'm just not talking about your institution, I'm just talking about my experience, that because course leaders or subject experts are, they love their subject. The subject feels like the most powerful change-making thing at their disposal. The curriculum is the most change. That's where it happens. And if that were true, then I don't think we would be having these long conversations around employability. I think if subject specificity and subject expertise was the answer, then it would be the answer. But it's not, because you can have, and I've seen a lot of, you know, people leave as subject experts who are not employable, or struggle to feel employable. So I think it is in some of this sort of, I go on LinkedIn, you know, and I see lots of people that I worked with and taught X number of years ago are being, you know, because of the redundancies, that there are young people going through their first experience of redundancy. And I'm actually beginning to think that maybe in one of your units, those units around kind of like employability, one of them should be on redundancy, because redundancy is always an issue of identity and all of those other issues. So redundancy is like, there is no job for life. It feels like that. If I was a course leader now, and I was looking to create employability Velcro and sort of and enhance it, I think you'd absolutely having to talk about and acknowledge the churn and redundancy as workplace behaviors that you could actually get some head start with, and actually have some, you know, I love the work you've been doing, where you know that you said that lovely thing where you were describing that the job of the employability units in years 1 and 2 and 3, whatever, are about people engaging with industry. That idea of problematizing the idea of employability, making sure that it's understood as complicated and as about a bunch of issues, and that there's difference in that space, starts to feel like the most responsible thing, you know, the most responsible expression of that chat. Because I think employability is like this zero-sum game for lots of people. It's like it's winning or something, and actually a lot of people, by that token, a lot of people are going to lose. A lot of people feel like they're losing, but that
Yeah.
And I think that's why we've got this backwash going on around winners and losers and employability. So some of the work you're doing sounds really like going back in and making it as complex as it actually is. It seems like a very, very interesting space to open up, really.
Yeah, do you know, you made two brilliant points, actually. I must say the first one really around that kind of the primacy of subject knowledge within students' minds and within kind of course leaders' minds. I completely concur with that, you know, and yeah, I also know lots of grads who are brilliant typographers or brilliant, you know, photographers or whatever, you know, but that's not kind of what it's about. But what I want to talk about in a little bit more detail is your point about this thing about redundancy and you know, like thinking about employability beyond getting a first job or getting your foot on the ladder. You know, like I think it's so important. It's so, and actually I'm pleased that it's one of the things that I've been talking about with Sherry Ellis, and I must give a huge big up to Sherry because she is amazing. She's my I work with her. She's head of work-based learning, and she, you know, lots of the ideas I'm talking about today come from brilliant conversations with her, really. But so one of the things that we've been talking about is the careers lab's responsibility beyond graduation, and thinking about what aftercare looks like for a degree course, and it feels like common sense, but actually it's a conversation that I don't think is had very often, you know. And like you talking about redundancy, and you know, like somebody kind of a year out of college, and we had an event a few months ago, and I, you know, went to the pub with like some of, you know, my alumni that I kind of know really well and was really pleased to see, and they were talking about all of these kind of decisions that they were having to make around, you know, do I go freelance now? You know, I've been in the same role for 2 years. I need a pay rise. You know, how do I negotiate that? You know, like, and all of that just stuff that is part of professional life. And it just, the thought occurred to me is just like, well, why aren't we in this with them? You know, why aren't we providing a kind of forum for these students to meet for these graduates to meet other graduates in their position and discuss these things? And I'm really pleased to say that, you know, part of kind of those insights really is, you know, I've been kind of fighting quite hard to try and bring our alumni management or community, or the fostering of our alumni community into the creative lab. So that becomes, because that network, if you can build it, that community, if you can build it, yeah, it's going to bring you projects. It's going to feed work-based learning, but it's also going to enable this kind of aftercare web that it be so powerful, you know, like, and for us to actively engage with those, I suppose, milestones in people's careers, you know. Or what about if we have a rave late that's called 1 year on, you know, like, and we pull our students together. I was literally on LinkedIn this morning, and there's one of our alumni who runs a content creation studio called Noosa, Toby, and he was basically saying, look, I've been really successful. I've got this agency that employs 15 people. How the fuck do I scale? You know, how the hell do I put in the infrastructure? How do I set up a proper HR support? You know, can anyone help? You know, and it wasn't because he doesn't know what he's doing, but he was just being very smart and open about it. And I was just immediately said to him, Toby, why don't we set up an event? I'd love to hear you talking about your challenges alongside other alumni talking about their challenges. And I'd love our current students to sit and listen to that and engage with it. Wouldn't that be brilliant? So sorry, long answer, but I 100% agree with you about that aftercare piece and about, thinking about all of the different things that students are going to experience beyond getting a job or setting up a business.
I know Tony's going to wrap up. Anybody's meant to be wrapping up now, but I just want to say one last thing, if I may. And we just finished this project where we were fortunate to interview the likes of Zandra Rhodes and Stephen Jones, and sort of Zandra Rhodes is sort of long-time collaborators in fashion design. And just in late December, we went up and did our last interview with Stephen Jones, OBE, for services to millinery. Apparently, he's the only one, the only OBE that's against millinery. Anyway, and he
did he give you that hat?
No, he didn't. Trust me, he would have burnt this hat. He would have burnt this hat. But the point about it, he was wonderfully and warmly honest, and that our conversations were about drawing out his advice to people seeking to enter creative industries or a career in fashion, whatever. And he talked about how on every day he one half of his brain is panicking, he does, and the other part of his brain knows exactly what it's doing. And it really struck me that there is a useful idea there about this kind of doubled vision of employability, or this doubled vision of how we might go about talking about it. Because I think when you talk about like CVs and when you talk about those things, it feels like what you're giving people is a kind of a cookie cutter, a sort of a cookie cut guarantee, and you're producing this failure of expectations in two directions. But to hear someone who is as experienced and successful as this particular practitioner say that he, even now, has a double vision, and that he has a doubled vision of his career, which is that he both knows and doesn't know, and yet what his job is to look at both of those visions and sort of reintegrate them and then do the next piece of work. And I just I can't think of a more honest expression of sort of expertise plus imposter having to be separated and reintegrated, and I can imagine that messaging to people who are sort of trying to understand what the next bit looks like and trying to understand how to sort of get their first job. That notion that it is always a double vision, that the job, the important skill is to sort of do the reintegration piece, to know that it's happening at the same time, and then move on. Seemed to me, perhaps now I'm saying it out loud, seems quite obvious, but to me it's like to acknowledge that certainly in the idea of what do we mean by employability and how can we sustain it and how do we walk the walk. The idea that some of the most experienced, successful people are reintegrating those two parts of their brains every day in order to go on just seems like a pretty useful, straightforward message to me.
Yeah, agreed 100%. The recognition of not knowing is fundamental.
And knowing,
isn't it?
It's knowing and knowing, and it's the fact that they are. You have to keep doing that every day, and there's something about confidence and how you might facilitate that muscularity in young people. That would be kind of a meta lifelong learning employability skill right there, to know, and to be able to do that maneuver would be a gift, I think.
Yeah, no, I 100%. It's a good point to end, right? I think.
I mean, I get the feeling we could carry on a lot there, because there's through this conversation, there's lots have come out around some very big subjects around power, inclusivity, social justice, problematizing employability, which I think really starts to get towards more of a center of why this is such a problematic area. And I think there's a lot to unpack there, but I hope in that discussion we've succeeded to some degree in showing why it isn't a quick fix, it isn't easy, and why this disconnect does persist, and why both parties, employers and graduates, often don't understand the other, and all these kind of nested problems. So Derek, thank you so much for joining us to share your expertise, and Phil as well, and your perspectives on that, to sort of break this open as a topic. And just really interested to see where you go with Creative Lab. Very best of luck to you with future projects, and just very interested to see how you continue to work on this to integrate employability into the curriculum at Ravensbourne.
And your LinkedIn posts, your Rave Late, are always, you know, they always look incredibly dynamic and exciting. I just think, can I come? I just think to myself, like, no.
They are. It's interesting, because I think one of the things we'd like to do is to open them up beyond students, really. And one of the reasons why we record them, you know, is that, you know, they, in some ways, they are, you know, like some of the kind of, there's one level that you could appreciate the debate from, and that's as a student. But actually, I think what's always brilliant. So we had Uncommon, we had Dixon Baxi, and we had Weirdo. And what was brilliant is that they all got in touch with me at the end of the next day and went, I learned so much, you know, about doing that, you know, like from the other practitioners, you know, and that's kind of what you want, really. So can I just say thank you to you two for inviting me on, and also, you know, kind of huge respect for the work that you're doing, and the kind of setting up things like this. And you know, the reason I engaged with you on LinkedIn is because I felt that the ideas that you were putting forward are super refreshing, you know. So yeah, thank you for having me on, and thank you for the work.
We'll keep doing what we're doing. You keep doing what you're doing, Derek, and hopefully somewhere paths will collide again.
Middle, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Brilliant. All right. Thanks a lot.